Thank you everybody for joining us for this inaugural session of our new seminar, Digital Materialities. So just a few words about the seminar and then we'll introduce our first speaker, Marine. So the seminar is, or the webinar I should say, is a new webinar that we're setting up this year in due part to the current situation and the difficulty of organizing face-to-face seminars, but also trying to take this as an opportunity maybe to speak to a wider audience. And it's great to see that there's a good turnout for this session. So just a few guidelines about how we run this. Please mute your microphone when you come in so that there's no echo or anything. Marine will be sharing her screen and obviously we'll hear her. Keep your questions to the end. She'll be speaking for about half an hour and then we'll have half an hour for questions. For questions, because I can't see everybody on the one screen, please use the chat function and maybe chat or send a message to me or Géraldine Chouard, the co-host who's going to be talking in a minute. So that we can then sort of tell you you're the next to ask your question. We'll kind of try to order the questions so that everybody can have a time to speak, but not all at the same time. So I hope that works for you. And just a few words about the other sessions. So we have a session every month for this seminar. So Marine is the first speaker. We'll have a session on the 14th of December where we'll be hosting Dr. Sirene Dyer from Montfort University in Leicester, who's going to be talking about her book on reconstructing the lives of women through material objects. And the object that she chose is the door that's behind me, or the collection of doors that's one of them is behind me. In January, we'll be hearing Dr. Benedict Pavot-Miyamoto, who will be talking about drawing books and the material practices of drawing books. In February, we'll have Sophie Pittman, who's going to be talking about reconstructing a 16th century doublet. We'll hear in March from Hélène Valence about the Great Time Clock of America. In April, we'll have Dr. or Professor Amanda Herbert from the Folger Library talking about a project on food and the material history of food and recipes. And the last session in May will be about Soviet candies, so we'll be closer to the 20th century. So with no further ado, let Géraldine present our first speaker, Marine.
Thank you very much, Ariane. It's well, I would like to thank you first for co-hosting this event with me. It's the first one. It's the first webinar of a series that we have just presented. I would like to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar, and it's a very great pleasure to have Marine Bellégo as our first speaker. Marine Bellégo has recently joined the LARCA, and she's a maître de conférence, assistant professor, specializing in history and science, and more particularly on environmental studies, material culture, and Indian history. And she's currently preparing a book on the history of the Calcutta Botanic Garden in the 19th century. And Marine, if I forgot anything, feel free to add some elements that might help us to know you before you present your paper on the central function of colonial botanical gardens in the late 19th century. Thank you, Marine.
Thank you very much, Géraldine and Ariane, for organizing this session. I think you have said everything that was relevant about me. Let me try to share my screen now. Okay. So can you see? Yes, that's fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Great, okay. So this talk will be organized around one part of my PhD thesis. A thesis in which I explored the history of the Botanic Garden in Calcutta in the late 19th century. How do I change slides? Yeah, okay. Now you see my second slide, right? Okay, excellent. So this picture shows the staff of the Botanic Garden posing in front of the great banyan tree, its most emblematic tree. The black and white pictures, that I will show are part of the collections of the National Herbarium situated in the Calcutta Garden. These pictures were not catalogued and few of them were dated, but several things indicate that they were taken in the last decade of the 19th century or the first decade of the 20th. Let me sum up very briefly what the PhD project was. So the Calcutta Garden was established at the end of the 18th century by the East India Company. During the 19th century, it evolved into a center for the acclimatization and classification of plants. Young plants were nurtured into in its nurseries, such as the one on this picture, and distributed to various institutions. The garden was funded by the imperial government and flourished during the last 3 decades of the 19th century when the Raj, the British Empire, reached its apex. It was the age of high imperialism, as it was called. Calcutta remained the capital of British India until 1911, and the garden contributed both economically and symbolically to the imperial system. Considerable work has been done about colonial botanic gardens, which were organized into networks and were used by imperial powers to transplant and exploit useful species such as tea, opium, mahogany, or cinchona. Historians such as Brockway, McCracken, and Drayton have insisted upon global botanical networks and the role they played in colonial exploitation. The history of the Calcutta Garden itself has often been told, so I wasn't the first, far from it, to tell this story. And this story was told especially by the British themselves. The botanists who were in charge of the garden wrote its history many times. And one important paradigm of those histories is that of plant introduction, such as shown in this poster, produced by the Calcutta Garden in the 1980s. According to this paradigm, botanic gardens introduced new species to countries where they did not grow before. After some research, I realized that many histories of the Calcutta Garden took for granted these types of internal histories, and to some extent, presenting colonial gardens as functional global institutions followed the ways in which these institutions represented themselves in colonial times. The archives that I consulted soon made clear that many aspects of the garden were dysfunctional and that there was a strong tension between the idea of the global and local realities. So what I tried to do was to elaborate a micro-history of the garden. I took a step back from the usual narrative to explore the very mundane, down-to-earth details of the functioning of this botanic garden. I was especially interested in things that didn't work and in the way materiality could resist botanical and colonial projects. In the first year of my PhD, I came across heaps of papers that had been cast aside in an abandoned house of the garden. As you can see, they were not in pristine condition. Fortunately, the garden's authorities allowed me to use those documents, to class them, to read them, to copy them. Sadly, they have now been destroyed. It's very sad. They contained many files about the daily routine of the garden, and especially of its herbarium, the place where botanical documents were stored. The problem of storing and preserving documents was especially difficult when it came to dried specimens of plants, the objects that functioned at the basis of theoretical botanical work. Here are some another picture of the documents, the house in which I found those documents. And this is the room in the herbarium where I was allowed to deal with the documents. So one reason why those papers were abandoned a few years ago is very probably that there was not enough space in the herbarium itself. And interestingly, many of the letters and reports that I found among these papers dealt precisely with managing documents, where to store them, how to preserve them, which was a major problem at the end of the 19th century. George King, the director of the garden, complained about, I quote, the chronic overcrowding of the herbarium building in which he had to work. Since collections of specimens were supposed to increase, existing space to accommodate them soon became insufficient. What was worse, the roof of the herbarium building leaked and makeshift solutions had to be found. This image shows corrugated iron sheets in the herbarium building used to protect specimens from leaks. So, in the second part of my thesis, I focused on what the garden produced, and especially on its relationship to documents, which was a complicated relationship. Producing and managing documents was not accidental to imperial activities at the time. It was central. I focused on the special case of specimens, the place they had in this documentary economy. For the British botanists who worked in the garden, the outcome of their botanical labor consisted in books and publications, especially monographs about particular species. This was what they considered as their proper work, contrary to economic botany, for example, which the government wanted them to do. Those books, the books they published, earned them scientific recognition. And in order to produce those books, botanists used specimens. So just to give you an idea, those are examples of plant specimens, two digital images of specimens of the same plant, actually, Cinnamomum porrectum. Both were collected in Calcutta at the end of the 19th century. We can perhaps go back to these images later. One problem with botanical specimens is the difficulty to recognize real-life plants from their desiccated counterparts. Charles Darwin wrote to his colleague in 1877, "It is dreadful work making out anything about dried flowers. I never look at one without feeling profound pity for all botanists, but I suppose you are used to it like eels to be skinned alive." Botanical specimens have interested historians of science for various reasons. One classical problem in history of science is the role of inscriptions and the relationship between knowledge and objects. Bruno Latour, in his classical book, Science in Action, published in 1988, created the concept of immutable mobiles to refer to stable documents carrying inscriptions and therefore information from one place to another. Lauren Daston has examined the role of type specimens in the standardization of botanical nomenclature. Anne Secord has studied how specimens could contribute to the elaboration of geographical knowledge. So what I tried to bring to this body of research was an analysis of the relationship between the material dimension of specimens and their scientific character. How were these objects made? How was a plant turned into an object? What happened to it? On what conditions did they become and remain scientific objects? What were the contradictions between being stable and being mobile? And this analysis showed that two very important processes in the turning of a plant into an object were desiccation and poisoning. I tried to relate those processes to broader colonial preoccupations, such as a distrust for wetness, especially wet climates, and the idea that poisoning and progress could go hand in hand. I also established that specimens were not only functional or instrumental. In themselves, they symbolized the power of colonial botanists to create science out of nature, or to derive science from nature. Let us first focus on desiccation. In order to produce specimens, the garden's authorities used the work of Indian collectors who were sent on expeditions. Some colonial amateurs also contributed, notably in the army. One problem was to ensure that plants were correctly treated when collected so that they would become specimens in the end. In order to be preserved, plants had to be dried thoroughly and quickly, but the process was long, repetitive, tiresome, and often failed. This irritated one botanist of the Calcutta Garden, George Henderson, who wrote in 1874, "It shows a great want of ingenuity amongst botanists that the method of drying specimens in a few hours has not been discovered." David Prane, director of the Calcutta Garden in the late 19th century, wrote in 1890 a 9-page manual about the drying of plants for herbarium. These instructions were sent to people who would collect plants for the garden. Although it was quite short and rather simple, an official from the Department of Land Records and Agriculture complained that it was too complicated to be used by regional officers. In this set of instructions, Prane warned against not drying plants thoroughly enough. I quote, "If a single half-dried plant be stowed away along with others completely dry, in a week's time the whole package will be rotten." So what was used to dry plants was paper, interestingly. And there were debates about what kind of paper was especially suited for the various stages of plant desiccation. Some botanists recommended a kind of paper specially made for botanists called benthal botanical paper. This particular paper had to be imported from England, and David Prane advocated instead the use of a thick grey blotting paper made in Indian prisons. I quote, "This is not only the most efficient drying paper made in India, it is surpassed by no material in the world." It was also cheaper and more easily available. There were many links between gardens and prisons, to which maybe we can go back if we have time. Paper was then used again to mount specimens. So mounting a specimen means gluing it on a piece of paper to preserve it and to store it. There was sometimes a problem of size in mounting, such as in the case of palms, because palms were really long often. Thick paper called manila paper was considered most suited to mounting, and this kind of paper originally came from the Philippines, was then manufactured in England and imported back to Calcutta. So this is an example of materials actually going back and forth from between Europe and Asia. And of course, paper in the form of books was the final repository of the knowledge that botanists derived from their consultation of specimens. So all these kinds of paper really made me curious, and it's part of a future project to maybe investigate more about how paper was made, what kind of fibers were used. In this story, it's all the more relevant as in fact, the Botanic Garden produced fibers designed for the making of paper. So in order to become objects, plants had to be dried, but such objects remained fragile, which was a problem, especially in the case of type specimens, which were used as the primary reference for identifying a species. Ideally, type specimens should last forever, botanists explained. Theoretically, once dried, plants could keep indefinitely. So, a type specimen should be the epitome of stability. It should last forever. If it disappears, there is a problem. However, the stability of specimens and the papers that supported them were never completely assured. In the Calcutta herbarium, white ants and rats put all documents at risk. Moisture was high, especially during the rains. So the process that was used to preserve documents from pests and humidity alike was called poisoning. So this is a quote from the Bengal Forest Manual, which gives advice to help botanists preserve specimens. To ensure they're not being eaten by insects, specimens should be painted over with a saturated solution of corrosive sublimate in spirits of wine. This not only saves them from being eaten by insects, but it also prevents the partial reabsorption of moisture incident to a damp climate from resulting in the formation of destructive mold or fungus growth. So the aim of poisoning was to ensure that the plant, once it was dead, once it was dry, did not attract other forms of life. The poisoning process was not something you did just once. It was frequent, and the quantities of poison used are truly impressive. The Indian Museum in Calcutta, for example, acquired a special pump, an apparatus, for, I quote, poisoning specimens with corrosive sublimate. Corrosive sublimate is the substance that was most common to poison objects. It was in fact another name for mercuric chloride, a compound that was soluble in water and highly toxic for pests as well as for humans. It was used on all kinds of papers, which were liable to be eaten, as my own experience in the archives confirm. Papers are indeed eaten, and worms sometimes create interesting patterns in those archives. So there were many poisonous recipes destined to help archivists and botanists preserve documents. It's very common in colonial manuals to find recipes of poison. They are very interesting. The imperial entomologist Henry Maxwell Lefroy advised the use of what he called a book solution. Solution being a substance, right? Not a solution to a problem, although it was a solution to a problem too. Another insecticide, of which a bottle should be in a locked cupboard in every bungalow, is book solution, made of spirit, corrosive sublimate, and carbolic acid. It is a deadly poison. With a long brush, it should be painted it should be painted onto the books and covers of the books, as also inside the cover. No cockroach will then attack the book, nor will fish, insects, or beetles harbor in it. Naphthalene, derived from tar and then from petroleum, was also massively used. The Indian Museum in Calcutta used 200 pounds a year of naphthalene. In the Botanic Garden, a special cupboard was dedicated to keeping poison, bish in Bangla. It is interesting to note that the last decade of the 19th century also saw the beginning of the use of chemical pesticides for crops, right? And the use of pesticides was considered as a rational path to agricultural progress. So it can be seen as an example of what Soraya Boudia and Nathalie Jess have recently called toxic materiality. I think it's interesting to situate the use of poison to preserve documents in the broader colonial use of substances, toxic substances meant to select one form of life over another. So drying and poisoning plants enabled natural elements to be turned into scientific objects. For the botanists of the Calcutta Garden, botany was a European science. The making of specimens was labor intensive. Many Indians were employed to produce such objects, but their work was very rarely recognized in the finished product. So the point I wanted to make is that what happened with specimens, I think, has to be situated in the documentary complex of the empire. If you were a colonial officer, what you could be proud of, if you could be proud of something, was managing documents properly. It can be seen, for example, in Leonard Woolf's testimony of his time in Ceylon. Performing a perfect census was what would get you a promotion. So botanists in the garden were colonial officers, and their peculiar link to documents was embodied in the pride they could take in the fact that they managed in what they considered adverse conditions to actually create and preserve what they called scientific objects. They were proud of their specimens. They sent them abroad, they exchanged them. They were objects of value, not only instrumental, but they represented what science was for those colonial officers. So dried, poisoned plants were what colonial botanists considered as science. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Shall I stop? Okay. Ariane, I can't hear you. I think you have to turn on your...
Yep. Thank you very much, Marine, for this fascinating talk on poisoning, how to poison plants and other forms of life or poison other forms of life to preserve plants. So if you have questions, please, as I said at the beginning, use the chat box to maybe signal your question, and then you can, once I've seen who wants to ask what question, then I can sort of distribute, me and Geraldine can distribute the order of the questions. So I've got a new question. So Ari wanted to ask a question. So Ari, you can unmute yourself, and then we'll have Sandeep.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. My question was, I was thinking, were they using local knowledge on plants? Were they using like local forms of taxonomies on plants, or did they consider that it was like a use of nature, quote unquote, that was somehow savage or barbaric, and that the only true knowledge that you could use was Western and civilized? Thank you.
Yes, this is a very interesting question, which has been studied especially for the 18th century. What happened was there was interest among British botanists for local forms of knowledge, local uses of particular plants. They recorded them. So in encyclopedia, you would find mentions of how Indians, I can see where, how Indians used plants. In the late 19th century, I would say that colonial people were, they wanted to archive that. They wanted to record what was going on locally with plants. They also, of course, completely refused those practices, the status of science. They sometimes talked of superstition, but not always. Some sources are very neutral about this. So there is many information, which I found interesting, and they are not necessarily judgmental. But what is sure is that what science was for them was what they were doing exclusively. So this is important, I think, when we deal with appropriation, because yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered properly.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think then we had Sandeep, and then we had Sylvie, and after that, Ladan. So Sandeep, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maureen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking presentation. I totally loved it. And this is something that is very close to my heart. So I'm going to carry on from where Ari left, because that was my question and he colonized it, but that's absolutely fine. So I'm just thinking about local indigenous knowledges. I'm not thinking just about local knowledges, because local knowledges in this case meant European trained Calcutta scientists as well.
Exactly.
So I'm not thinking about that. And
yeah.
I do remember you mentioning sometime that you were learning or you could speak Bengali. So I wonder if you can read Bengali, because there are archives that exist. I can't, but if you can read Bengali, there are archives that exist. So I'm just thinking about what is very fascinating at this moment in the what we call the colonial, decolonial, post-colonial turn, which is Priyamvada Gopal's premise that there is a reverse tutelage, that she's talking about anti-colonial dissent, but she's also talking about there is, for example, Forster as an example of reverse tutelage. So if you look at Amitav Ghosh, for instance, the Hungry Tide, you've got the figure of Fakir, who is a Dalit person, an untouchable person, teaching that American marine biologist about dolphins. So I'm thinking in terms of botany, in terms of plants, picking up from Ari Strand, if there is some kind of reverse tutelage happening in the 19th century, not particularly in English, but in Bengali maybe. I don't know.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, I've never heard this phrase. Reverse tutelage, is that it? Inverted tutelage?
Reversed, I think.
Reversed, yes, okay.
Reverse tutelage.
Reversed, okay. Yes. I mean, I came across examples of this. And interestingly, botanists were often complacent, saying that they had this great gardener speaking Bangla and who could explain to them very precisely what kind of plants this and this was, okay? And it's also very condescending sometimes. I mean, they admire people, Indian people, they admired them for their memory, but never granted them the faculty of reasoning. So it was a very, very selective admiration. But what you say makes me think that I should perhaps, yes, do more about this. I hadn't thought about Amitav Ghosh, but yes, I mean, it makes sense. Yes, great, thank you.
Thank you. Then we had a question by Sylvie Nail. I don't know whether you can unmute yourself. Or whether you want me to ask the question. Maybe I'll ask the question. There you go. There you go. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Marine. Most interesting. I was wondering while you were talking whether you would say that this process of desiccation and poisoning as part of the colonial enterprise was similar, if you have any knowledge of that, as to what the Spanish Empire was doing. I'm thinking of the late 18th century expeditions. Would you have any knowledge if they had the same approach to the colonial enterprise through plants? Thank you.
I don't know much about what the Spanish did with their plants. I think that drying was one of the most common practices to preserve plants. But what was striking, I think, in this case is that dried specimens became the objects on which botanical science was based, rather than, for example, drawings or paintings. Although sometimes the two could be complementary, right? For example, in one of the specimens that I showed earlier, there is drawing, on the specimen sheet. So this is also interesting. But as to the differences, a comparative history of Spanish and British practices of botanical collection, I don't know much about that. Sorry.
Thank you. And then we had Ladan who wanted to ask a question. And then, yes, there is more time for other questions, but Ladan first, and then we'll have Richard.
Thank you very much. Fascinating paper. I loved it, Marine. Listening to you, I was a little bit thinking of the process that was going on at the end of the 18th century with the various Asiatic societies in India, in Calcutta, and also in Mumbai. Some years ago, our colleague Jean-Marie Fournier was on a mission to Mumbai, and he wanted to visit the archives of the Asiatic Society, and the kind of state in which he found the documents was very much the kind of state in which you found your documents. So thinking of similarities between the two situations of those Asiatic societies and the botanical garden in Calcutta, I was wondering if we are in the same kind of Orientalist scenario of people creating a kind of system within a system, with those Orientalists or those botanists who are neither here nor there, neither parts fully of the imperial system that is sending them out, nor fully part of the contributors to something good for the locals. So that once they're out of the picture, that kind of heritage becomes extremely uneasy as a heritage for the locals who just prefer to get rid of maybe not actively, but to leave things to literally rot as a kind of uneasy heritage of something that they cannot use as a form of resistance against the former colonizers, and which is not in-your-face colonialism all the same. How do you feel this? I wondered how you felt the analogy to work or not to work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, in colonial times, in many respects, the garden was separated. It worked as an entity on its own, and the agenda of botanists did not necessarily correspond to what was expected of them in terms of concrete action. The government wanted them to be useful economically, and they wanted to do what they called science. So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly like the Orientalists of the Asiatic Society. Indeed.
Yes. So it's what has been said for the past 30 years about the empire not being something coherent, not being something consistent, but being consisting of various trends, various kinds of interests, etc. So that's completely relevant. And the other thing is what happens now with the documents. There is an ambiguity with those documents. And I think that is thanks to this ambiguity that I could write my thesis, in fact, because those documents were unimportant. And so they were thrown away, but not destroyed. They were not important enough to be destroyed.
Wow.
So that was, I was incredibly lucky to find them, because frankly, the story would have been, I don't think, I mean, my thesis would not have been the same. I mean, it would have been completely different without those documents. So I'm grateful to this ambiguity. On the other hand, current botanists in the garden tend to appropriate the colonial heritage in the sense that they, they keep the same tutelar figures of the white British botanists, along with the later Indian botanists who succeeded them. It seems to be part of some sort of continuum in the garden. For example, there are portraits. If you go to the type section, the type specimen section, there are portraits of all the successive gardens directors. So there doesn't seem to be sort of a break, from the colonial past, which is interesting also. But
it's good to see the garden in the end using the botanist and not the other way around. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So I think Richard had a question. Richard Somerset.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks also for that. So I was just, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, I think, from most of you, because I'm a historian of science rather than a post-colonial.
Or a historian of plants.
Not of plants in particular, no, of science, I suppose.
Oh, science, sorry.
So maybe I have a slightly different sort of optic in a way, and I hope that's not a problem. Anyway, I suppose that the thing that struck me is that the procedures that you're describing people as using in collecting these plants, it seems to be pretty much straightforward and fairly obvious kind of thing to do as a naturalist. That what you do is you collect specimens and you try to preserve the specimens, and then you set about classifying them, and in doing that, well, you apply. That's what naturalists do in order to be scientists. You have a criterion that everyone shares. It's the Linnaean classification system, and you take your specimens and you try and find ways of fitting them into this unique classification system. Now, of course, that has all those colonial overtones about it that you would expect, but fundamentally, it's a given of science, isn't it? That's how the naturalist thinks, and if he's going to say, well, there are other ways of classifying this, well, okay, that's fine, but that's not going to give them the result that they're looking for. Anyway, so I suppose that's one part of what I'm wanting to say, is that there's a tension here, which I'm sure that they themselves were aware of, between their program, what they're trying to do, and what might be going on around them. There's a different way, and I don't think, I suppose to me it doesn't seem very surprising that they are just simply unthinkingly going to say, well, our way of doing it is what we're interested in, not even necessarily saying that it's the right way or the other way is the wrong way. It's just that's what we're doing. That's what being a naturalist is. But what I guess I would be more interested in hearing more about is, to what extent do you think that there might be an interface going on between whatever it is that they're taking out of local knowledge, and presumably there's at least some sort of level, like, well, where are you going to find this kind of plant, or where would I go to find other plants? All these sorts of questions might be the kinds of things that is part of local knowledge. But then perhaps there's also some sense in which the criteria by which they are ending out classifying their plants is not only predicated upon Linnaean criteria, but perhaps to some extent is also being coloured or influenced or shaped by the way of looking at their plants that they might be also absorbing from local patterns as well, I suppose.
Yeah, no, in fact, Linnaean criteria were outdated at the end of the 19th century. They were not in use. They had been replaced by what they called natural methods. So, I mean, those are questions in intellectual history of botany that I did not delve into precisely because I wanted to focus on the material history of specimens, but they are interesting nonetheless. I don't agree with you that it's obvious that what naturalists do is go collect plants, dry them, classify them, name them, and that's it. I precisely think that when you look into the details, you realize first that the botanists themselves did not go out, I mean, rarely went out alone to collect things. So the problem of employment of human resources is major there in this particular imperial history. And this is not straightforward. I mean, drying a plant, I mean, you might say that this is not particularly, central to botanical practice, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it matters how things were done. So if you look only at the final results, the book, which many historians of botanic gardens have done, you miss a great part of the story. That's my point. But thanks for your question.
If I may, I kind of had a question on the materiality. And I thought, you said you were grateful to the ambiguity that you found yourself faced with. And I was fascinated by an ambiguity that is at the core of your work, which is how it's when the material fails in a way that it becomes heuristic, that it, that it tells you something, but then it's how much must it fail before it's destroyed, and stops telling you anything because it's been destroyed, because it's been discarded and sort of thought of as, not worth preserving. And I think there's a really thin line or fine line here between, which is really maybe specific to material sources, which is, they only become revealing in a way when the materiality is difficult, when it fails. It's the failing of the material object that often contains a lot of information about the practices, the down to earth, the everyday, what did it actually involve to preserve plants, and not the finished product. But at the same time, if it fails too much, or when you find your sources in that chaotic room, which in a way is the dream of any historian to some extent, but then now they're lost. They're lost. You're the person who looked at them, and we're very grateful that you did. But then they become lost. So I just wanted to know whether you could reflect on that sort of more sort of a general reflection on materiality.
Yeah, it's excellent. Very well said, I think. Well, you have thought much more than me about materiality, I think, but it's very stimulating to think about it now. Yes, I mean, those objects that I found were in a state of in-between. They had failed in a way to reach the higher strata of the British administration. They didn't make it into the archives.
Yeah.
They had been archives, and they stopped at some point being archives. And I again made them into archives one last time before they were completely destroyed. I think when I started this investigation, I was sort of new to history. I mean, I was doing English before that, and so that was my first real contact with, you know, old documents, and that was very strong for me to be in contact with those documents. At the same time, there are problems with fetishizing the archives too much. Because then, I mean, if you do that, it's the problem. It's one of the main problems of colonial history, of course, which Laura Stoller explores continually. So I don't want to be carried away too much with, you know, telling this story of how I, you know, kind of found this miraculous archival fund, because this would be also problematic to some extent. So I don't know. I'm also ambiguous in this respect.
Thank you. Are there any more questions in the audience?
I might have one, Marina.
Yes.
I'm very curious about your research work. Describe it. It's so unusual. It's so unique. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Do you mean the research that I will do in the future, or what I have done?
Well, both actually, but what you've done so far.
Well, yes. So my identity when I was doing my PhD was a historian of science. So what I was trying to investigate was what happened in the colonial garden in terms of knowledge. So how was knowledge turned into science? What was called science? So that was part of the theoretical framework. And then the questions that I finally answered emerged just while I was actually investigating. So, for example, the question about poisoning objects, specimens. I didn't know much about specimens before I started this research. But in fact, I mean, one thing with my thesis and the future book is that it's at the crossroads of many topics, because one of my points is that the Calcutta Garden was a microcosm through which you can study broader, more general phenomena of the empire. So it's a prism through which to explore in a new way some famous and classical imperial phenomena. That's the idea of the book. Along with showing nice pictures and things like that.
Forward to it. To reading your book. Yeah. When is it due?
It is due in 2 weeks. It's horrible. I don't know what to do. I don't know.
It's due to the publisher.
Yes.
Yeah.
To the publisher. Yeah, it will not be published before a few months,
but maybe we can say it's going to be published by the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle.
Yes,
am I correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for specifying it.
There's a last question from Magda.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. And I have a question. Could you tell us a few words about exactly what did you do with these papers just before they were thrown away and destroyed? What exactly physically have you done? Thank you.
Yes, so I found them, there were heaps and piles of papers, okay? So I was afraid that I wouldn't be allowed to use them. But in fact, when I showed people in charge what they were, they actually helped me move them from the house to the herbarium. So they enabled me to, I mean, there were like 4 men helping me concretely transporting these masses of paper from the house to the herbarium. And then I spent a few days going through them. And basically extracting what was of interest to me, which was very selfish. And so the rest, so the files that were most interesting for me, I took pictures of them. So I have about 5,000 pictures, I think. The rest, I didn't have time to go through them. And later, I mean, I returned to the garden the years following, and for 2 years I found them back, but then I didn't go to the garden for some time, and a friend who went there recently told me that there was no trace of them, and that the botanists, the people there, said that they had been destroyed. So I'm not sure that it's the case, but I think it's very likely because they didn't know what to do with them. So that's what I did.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well,
Thank you.
very much, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you, Marine, for your really interesting and thought-provoking talk, as everybody said. But yeah, no, I'm very glad that we have you as a new colleague in our department.
I'm also very glad. And thank you for all your great questions.